Okay, welcome. Hey, you talking with Gregg, Nick, and Andrea. Woohoo! We're back.
Yeah.
After a couple of holidays and other weekend stuff, certainly for me, my parents coming down and all that, but it's great to see you guys.
You too, Gregg. Always great.
Yeah.
Good to be back in this action. So we've been bouncing around a number of different conversations on the list and other kinds of things. You want to, anybody have things they want to jump off with in relation?
Well, no, Andrea, you had talked about, you wanted to talk about some of these different aspects of justification systems.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think I went back and revisited that chapter a little bit and just took some of notes of my understandings of those distinctions. So if we can go right into that, if you want.
Fine for me. I am especially interested in how we can talk about the three different aspects of the problem of justification, namely the personal one, the social one, and the analytical one. And so I'm really interested in how we can differentiate between them, because in my opinion, one of the great issue about this is if there is actually a sharp line between, for example, the social aspect of justification and the analytical one. For example, as you may know, Sperber and Mercier think that basically there is no a thing like a pure reason, but the reasoning is always embedded in social context. And so, for example, I think they wouldn't agree that a pure analytical aspect of the problem of justification actually exists. And so I want to dig into that and
Perfect. Yeah.
hear your suggestions. Yeah.
So let's just so folks are following along, let's talk a little bit about setting it up, and then we can be clear about what I mean, because other people don't have read the chapter necessarily. So just so that so basically the narrative is as follows, that I track. That is that as social primates, we humans, first, you see this in baboons, you see this in all the social primates, very, very complicated social lives of cooperation and competition. Your place in the status hierarchy is key. You have to read who your allies are, who you competed, there's female, male aspects of all of this. I think that we upgrade our capacity. I think Michael Tomasello's work is very clear that we upgrade our capacity in the last million years or so to transcend the rest of the great apes in our capacity for implicit intersubjective mind sharing, meaning that my capacity to see your intention and attention and sync up with it and intuit it. And the classic here is, how kids at 18 months point and they intuitively know you're looking at something and will check back with you and intuitively understand that you have a perspective and that you're trying to do things, lots of experiments that show that even 2-year-olds are better than adult chimpanzees at tracking what people's intention are and syncing up with them and helping them and framing them. So, and I think that's all pre-linguistic. In fact, I think it's the social cognitive ground upon which the capacity for symbolic communication, broken symbolic communication emerges. And we'd also add mimicry into this. We'd also the musicality of our attention to capacity create rhythm together. All of that creates the ground of a intersubjective highway that then gets built. And then the argument is that there is a pretty big difference between the kinds of dynamics that are created when we shift from broken symbolic speech to symbolic syntactical speech that creates propositions. So the propositions are the building blocks of what become in the argument systems of justification. So these are the bricks And then the bricks form houses of sorts. Whatever would be the noded network where these are the parts and these are the claims that are made about what is and ought to be. And if you look at linguistics, they will argue that the fundamental unit of meaning in our language are propositions. And then I argue that propositions are also closely connected with questions. So propositions set the stage for factual states or affirmative claims about is and ought. Okay, so there are the antelope, we should go hunt them. But basically they'll have this flavor of is and ought. The is can be broken down in sort of, and I'll get to, this really does get into the analytic aspect of it, at least. The is the problem of accuracy, which I think at a simplistic level can be framed in terms of the correspondence theory of truth. Like there are antelope over there, does that statement correspond to the state of affairs of antelope being in the place where I say that they are? That's one aspect. And then another aspect is if I then say we should go hunt them, that becomes an explicit ought about value. But both of those are propositions. Claims of propositions can be broadly divided into is ought propositions. There are others, but it's complicated. And this is an easy initial taxonomy, an important distinction. Okay, so then we start dropping propositions into the world. They carry particular kinds of factual value claims. And then they also argue to open up, as they carry the affirmative space of whatever the claim is, they open up the negative space of whatever the counterfactual or alternative variant. And then the argument is that questions, why, what, where, how, automatically potentially create tensions with the claim. Okay, so then the claim is then pressed with other possibilities. And now you get a really interesting question-answer dynamic. If we go with Sperber and Wilson, who, by the way, footnote, Sperber and Wilson probably should have cited this. But anyway, if we go with Sperber and Wilson and we say, hey, this creates a very interesting reasoning capacity. It creates a reasoning capacity around shared collective intelligence. So you guys have your perspective, I have my perspective on this, and we can engage in argumentation. Can somebody mute whoever's with the dogs?
Oh, sorry.
If we can mute just a sec. So then we have shared communicative back and forth argumentation and collective distributive reasoning. And this is a part of the argument is that what really drives collective intelligence is this group reasoning argument. Okay, so that's the basic structure. I argue that we can frame these propositions then and the dynamic tension between the affirmation and the questioning that gives rise to then now the group has a problem of justification. Okay. And the problem of justification turns in what do we do with these propositional claims, or what are the presses upon these propositional claims? All right. And I argued that there are at least three presses that are obvious and need to be negotiated. One is the factual actual claim. Okay, so how do you know if the claim is there to carry truth value about is and ought, how do you know that it corresponds? And I call that the analytic problem, okay, which is basically, hey, is it accurate at some level? And we can then get into, actually, I believe that formal epistemology and philosophy is very much about really trying to hone in on a systematic approach to the analytic problem. But we have this in everyday terms. As somebody says, we're going to go hunt antelope. If somebody says we're going to go do these things, and then it doesn't correspond, we'll come back and say, hey, that was wrong. Were you lying? Why did you make the mistake? And obviously for these things to have value, they have to have some correspondence. So we'll be tracking the correspondence dynamic. That's one part of the problem. I'm not necessarily, and indeed I'm not really making the claim that we are, I think I'm making the exact same. In fact, I think really Sperber and Mayos are making the claim I made, which is that our primary reasoning device is not centered on the analytic problem, disconnected from the other problems. Okay, in other words, the thing that drives reasoning is the analytic problem in context of these other two problems, which are the personal problem and the social problem. And basically what I mean there is that these things are, we can analyze them as propositions in sort of abstract school and just pretend they disconnect. But when they emerge in the real world, these are really investments, okay? Meaning that people are spending energy on the claim, they take up cognitive space, they take up social space, and they have massive implications for us living pragmatically in the world. That's why we're talking about them. That's why we talk about antelope instead of some other thing. They take opportunity costs. So the mere investment in them is a value-based energy investment. It takes time and work to make comments and to be talking about stuff, and could be talking about other things. So it's all part of the investment dynamic. And then I basically argue that you can look at the investment dynamic across the lens of the individual's investment. Like I am talking about what I want to be talking about at some level, so that it has framed them from the vantage point of the interest of the individual. But then it sits in a social network context, which then either is another person. If I'm in one conversation, it's the other. Or if it's a group conversation, then you have the collective interest of the group. And so the basic argument is that, and these things certainly may overlap when they do. You know, you're in a groove, you experience the conversational flow state, and you go out and you agree to that, and woohoo, you get a lot of overlap. When these things press against each other, this creates tension, and then you have to negotiate between them. And that process is a huge part of what gives rise to the interpreter mental organ of justification system, is that it's very attentive and is tracking both the analytic or accuracy content of it in relation, and then the value relations, especially mine and the social group. So that's the summary of it. And then that's what I tried to articulate in the chapter, maybe not super clearly, but that was the goal. So if I said anything here that's useful relative to that articulation, but for folks that are listening, that's essentially the emergence of propositional speech, the question answer dynamic, and then the problem of justification as I see it.
So yeah, I'm not sure what are my thoughts about it, because I'm still like in tension between two different interpretations of this, but I'm linking to what I was saying before. So there is the Sperber and Mercer argument that says something like, we think we are claiming something objective on reality, but actually in reality, sorry for the play of words, but in reality, we are just talking about justification and arguments that are aimed to convince people to augment our social influence. And I am now linking more strictly to your work, Gregg. And so I think that is very difficult. So you say that there are two different aspects. So the social and the analytical one, and that of course they influence each other, but ultimately I think you think that they can be separated, that they are autonomous. And so I don't know if there is a primacy between them. So if the social aspect is more important than the analytical one, and so I want to discuss about this. Yeah.
So let me be clear about where I would say they can and can't be separated. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
That they're in the real pragmatic world. The arguments are completely entangled. Okay. So the real world of living means they're entangled. All right. And so there's press on, accuracy and influence and all of that in the actual argument, all of that. And the system itself, the interpreter system, is really a function of the dynamic interrelationship between the press, but it is an entangled mess at one level.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the real world. At the same time, we can aspectualize these different elements of it. And by aspectualize it, I mean, you can ask the question and people will try to sort this out all the time. It's sort of like, well, the entire process of how science evolves is that, well, shit, we have all of this social bias. We have these perspectival biases. We have value biases. We have the social construction of reality bias. How the fuck do we factor that out? Well, we can build a randomized controlled clinical trial, right? And then ask the analytic problem, if you take this pill versus if you take a sugar pill, and we compare these people as a group, and we have this idea of mechanism, and then these people do a lot better. Now we can then say the accuracy claim that this particular thing had this causal effect, whatever. Then you get into lots of sort of philosophy of science and whatever truth is and all of that. But you can definitely aspectualize correspondence truth claims relative to social value claims, relative to social value claims of a group, relative to social value claims of this other person, social value claims of me. So that I think you can aspectualize it, and I think you can certainly angle it in certain ways. So that's what I would say is that, yeah, you can definitely do that. It's a deep philosophical question, like postmodernism would, to answer the question of, well, how much entanglement are truth claims to social contextual views? Continental philosophy says, well, look at Wittgenstein's shift from, hey, I can develop a whole analytic philosophy about a picture theory of truth that really is about the analytic side. And it's like, well, actually, no, everyone's always playing language games. It's always embedded in context. So at a philosophical level, that's a great question. I have my frame on understanding that, you have to go to the whole unified theory and its theory of knowledge and relation in terms of getting that kind of things. But so I guess my question is sort of or my response is, the real world entangles it all. The egoic organ of justification is calculated to it all. It attends in dynamic relation to all the features and is influenced by all the features. Our capacity to disentangle it allows us to, like a scientist, pull out certain causal features and emphasize them and create aspects. And indeed, and even in conversation, people will say, very often, well, that's your motive, essentially. You're rationalizing, that's your motive. You're not seeing this objectively. We will definitely have access to our capacity to say, well, you're emphasizing one aspect of this flavor more than another. The real pristine way we could really separate them out, like at whatever level of, deep truth, that gets into then I think a whole sort of a different kind of philosophical question. So that's I don't know if that clarifies, but that's what I'm holding in relationship to it.
Can I add to that quick too? Because I've kind of tried to map this to different things that we've talked about. So I know there's a clear, and this is in that chapter, a clear relationship with mind 1, 2, and 3, although they get very entangled there as well. So I don't quite want to touch that mapping yet. I'm not so confident with it. But in terms of the Wilberian epistemological frames, analytical is very much like us systems, and definitely the third person empiricism. Personal is I, clearly, and social is just the intersubjective. And I think that could probably also, it's the we, but it could probably include the us as well.
Yeah, so I prefer, with the Wilber thing, yeah, so what I would say, I like the it's, that's the right-hand side, which is the objective, and that would be, when we try to get that kind of perspective, that definitely is more on the analytic, truth describe, independent of value and perspective. And then, yeah, definitely the personal, I, and the we is the social. I would say that's a very clean line of framing. The epistemological frame on those is very much what I'm getting at when I say, well, there's kind of an analytic, descriptive accuracy problem. There's my own personal perspective and my values there. There's us or whatever social dynamic who's ever entangled in this proposition and what it means. Totally.
So my question is, if you think, you, Gregg, and Henriques, you think that in scientific enterprise, for example, if the analytical or the social aspect, if one of these two aspects is more prominent than the other. So for example, I don't know. Of course, we live in 2021. There is the COVID virus, and so a lot of money is spent into research in biology on the virus, on the vaccines, and so on, rather than, I don't know, quantum mechanics or whatsoever. So my concern is, can there be, can we find a truth, okay, that is I won't say that it's disconnected from the social influence, but it's
right.
There is balance. I don't know how to frame it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you get it. So
totally.
The true knowledge system.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can certainly, here's the way I would frame it at this level. And that is the argument basically is that the Enlightenment, are you guys on? Oh, okay. The Enlightenment adopts sort of an epistemology of transcendental truth through science, meaning that, yep, we can, and we started, okay? And then you get the argument that we're starting to get, this is what really is independent of human, okay?
Yeah.
And people then are searching for the ultimate empirical statement that's independent of human. And then I would argue that nothing was successful in creating anything that would constitute a worldview that everyone had enough consensus on that this gives us base reality, okay? And then postmodernism basically is the philosophical transition that says, hey, you promised us transcendental realism, and then everything is immanent critique, and everything is contextualized, and there is nothing that transcends.
Yeah.
That's postmodernism. And then you take that to a particular point, okay? And that while that is an absolute, I believe, very powerful and valid critique in its weak form, by the weak form, I mean, yep, there's no way that it's true in terms of, you could take an extreme like Auguste Comte vision. We never achieved that of just positivism and everybody knows shit and they tried, they failed, okay? But then the issue is to say, well, if you take it to extreme that everything is immanent and contextualized and only defined in relationship to the social context, okay? If you start saying that's true, and we haven't achieved any transcendental truths scientifically, that gets ridiculous, I think. I mean, that starts to get really weird. What are you saying that, the earth elemental view of the Greeks is the same as the periodic table of the elements, that we didn't discover anything transcendent? You get the science wars. I mean, in the 1990s, the Sokol affair. You guys know the Sokol affair? No. You should know the Alan Sokol affair. You guys know the Sokol affair? So we should talk about this. It's great. It's a fascinating thing. And this is exactly this point. And this is the fundamental tension between, or at least it's the flashpoint tension between modernity and postmodernity, at least in academia. So what happens is you get more and more, we're really seeing this right now, by the way, like the diversity, equity, and inclusion that's grounded in critical race theory, to the extent that it mostly is a very postmodern critique of modernism, carries that epistemology. Back in the 1990s, okay, this was really taking root, this postmodern view, okay, where you would then say things like, well, we think 2 + 2 = 4 because we really, we try to strive for the value of accuracy and different things. Well, I was like, what? Okay. So then in this was picking up steam, okay, and there was a critical book came out from the left that was defenders of science, okay? So they it does Gross and somebody else. Anyway, in 1994, they released a very strong critique of excessive relativism, okay? And they said, from the left, we're really concerned that if everything goes into relativism, we will lose all of the knowledge that we have. And of course, this is an integral perspective completely, or at least, well, they're coming from orange, but they're critiquing green. Basically, right. Okay, but the teal people or whatever second tier can see the proper synthesis, right? But anyway, so they drop this, and then this special issue of the journal Social Text, which is a contextualized green postmodern view, okay, then it's going to come out and critique this book and say this book, we're going to defend our position in relationship to this book, okay? So there it is. Then, and that comes out in 1996. Inside the special issue, Alan Sokol is a theoretical physicist, okay? And he submits a journal article called Towards a Transformational Hermeneutic Dialogue About Quantum Mechanics. I'm getting there. That's not quite the right title, but basically it brings in hermeneutics and a transformational dialogue that tries to bridge the gap between the quantum mechanic view and general relativity. Okay, and it then shows then the applicability of postmodern contextual thinking to solving quantum mechanics in general and that. And they review it and they put it in, the social text comes out. Okay. And Alan Sokal then stands up right after it gets published. He says, that's all bullshit. It's a complete bullshit article. Okay. I strung together terms that you guys would like, and you guys would like a theoretical physicist to say, you know what you're talking about. And I could just stick in particular postmodern, well, here's a critique and this perspective allows for this and this opens up dialogue and blah, blah, blah. And they published it and he's like, this makes no sense. You guys don't know what you're talking about. That's the whole point. You allow for relativism and you lose touch with the analytic truth and everybody's yammering bullshit at each other with no capacity. The whole analytic angle is to cut through bullshit and you obviously can't do that. Okay.
Yeah. Now I remind reading that in your book. Yeah.
Yeah. I wrote about it in the book. It's it's sort of the pinnacle. And then from 1996 into the 2000s, I mean, this echoed for a decade. This was made the public. New York Times published it as a front page article when he came out with it. So everybody was like, and then what are the ethics of publishing a bullshit article? And everybody just got it was for academic, it was a classic clash of modern and postmodern views. And a lot of great, some shitty work, but some really good work actually came out. And to me, those kinds of analyses lay the groundwork for a meta-modern sensibility. Okay. And I believe the tree of knowledge, that's part of, when I talk about the Enlightenment gap, and I say there are two parts of the Enlightenment gap. One is matter-mind, this is on the list right now, and we know what consciousness is and what's the frame of mind and all that, okay? And the other is science and society and science and social knowledge, exemplified by the modern and postmodern tension, okay? And the meta-modern solution that we are after brings a naturalistic coherence to both of these problems simultaneously, so that actually we would then have consensual agreement about the tensions and the way to talk about them, okay, rather than these foundational disagreements that there is no common ground on. Okay, that's the argument is actually, we can actually make sense about what the point is, get clear, and then proceed, okay? So here's what in the tree of knowledge sides, with both, but it basically says, it's more with modernists than postmodern, but it basically says the following. They started to create a transcendental knowledge system, and they were partially successful in parts. Okay, what do I mean by that? I believe that quantum mechanics and general relativity reflect universal aspects of the universe. Okay, and that it's not that we discovered these ways of understanding. Yes, every particular discovery was itself a function of somebody's personal way of thinking, their drive, their need, but you can dump it all in and then you start to, the motives start to cancel each other out. And what arises is a better and better accurate depiction of the way the universe works. Okay. And then, so now and I would argue, if you don't think that quantum mechanics affords us an accurate picture of the way the world works, I think you have to defend that. And that's a very hard position to defend, okay?
Of course, yeah.
Right, and then the question then is, how grounded is it? I call this the Kantian versus Bhaskar question. The Kantian question is focused largely on epistemology, okay? And that is that the human mind creates the context that allows and our situation so that we have access to quantum phenomena through our phenomenology and our shared intersubjective phenomenology that inevitably creates the categories of mind. And so we can talk about how we understand it. And yes, clearly it has truth claims, but we're embedded in an epistemological idealism. It's really our ideas about the thing that we have knowledge of, not the thing in itself. Okay, that's one angle. And then Bhaskar says, but wait a minute, actually, we are making crystal clear claims about ontology at some level. And you can't reduce the ontological claims that we make just to our categories of mind. Okay, there is to be said something that is a hydrogen atom. All right. Now the question to me, the way you can talk about this, in fact, I was just listening to Michael Kakao. He's a physicist, and he writes a lot. Yeah, he just came out with a book called The God Theory. Okay, yeah. He just published The God Theory, which is basically the theory of quantum mechanics and general relativity getting unified through Einstein's grand unified theory. Hunt for theory of everything, whatever. And he has, exactly in the way he's describing it, he's a transcendental realist on this level, and he explains it exactly the same way I do. He envisioned as a kid other aliens, trying to make sense out of the universe, and his contention is that any galaxy, any intelligent alien who could understand the universe as well or better than we would arrive at the exact same basic conclusions about its essence. Okay? If that is true, then I think what you have is a very good argument for a transcendental realist ontology. Okay? What that means is that we have figured out a way to cancel out the human mind and achieve a description. Okay?
Yeah.
I think that's Bhaskar or whoever is the realist, the transcendental realists that focus on ontology, they win the argument if that's real. And the second thing is that what if we encountered an alien group and they've already plugged into like dark matter, dark energy, they don't need any of the shit that we use and have a better model for the universe that actually doesn't look like our universe at all. And ours looks like this narrow analysis of a particular path that give rise to the human consciousness that really is through quantum mechanics, and it actually is a function of the social construction of justification in our unique little world that helps us understand it, but actually aliens understand the whole fucking thing totally different and wouldn't need our ontology at all.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, but I think that still in these terms, the analytical problem of justification is inevitably connected with the institution of science, because if you cannot factor out the subjective and collective biases, and so I am wondering, does it exist a human tendency to know the truth, so to engage in analytical knowledge without the institution of science? For example, I'm thinking of ancient philosophy, and I do think that they are somehow analytical analysis of the reality. Just think about Aristotle's or Plato, and so in these terms, can we have an analytical tendency toward the world without a scientific methodology?
Yeah, this is great. Okay, so here's what I would argue. I would say that when we start off as oral indigenous people, okay, so 30,000 years ago, and there's lots of good evidence for this. The oral indigenous people think more embedded in real world situations that then actually have interest and experience and context all tangled up. Okay, so in other words, and that is where the default position is of our reasoning system. The whole argument is that we are actually shaped in nature to have the entanglement. And then, and then you have to actually, and they will certainly argue, though, they question each other about truth. Truth is a notion that they carry, at least in a local sense, like, is this right? Is this wrong? They certainly ask that. And they certainly understand that people have different perspectives and that they bias them. That's universal. Okay. But they don't think in the same analytic way that we think, but as a function of the evolution of culture, definitely. And if we follow our own Western culture, there's a particular path that we've related to the analytic problem. And it goes through, the easiest way to see it is the 1-2 step through the Western tradition. The first is the shift. I mean, there's a lot of things that are happening, but the first is the axial age shift. There's a Bronze Age shift. We can get into that. And I'm not a huge expert, but the best way to think about it from our tradition, and then what gives global science, is the Greek position. Okay, what happens with the Greeks? And what you get there is I like to think about it as the Pythagorean into Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, into modern science. These are the jumps. Okay, So what you get with Pythagoras, and it's very difficult to think about. I mean, it's a whole nother line in China and Hindu, and I don't have clarity and all this other stuff. This is a big enough chunk. But anyway, what you see with this, and it really does become more wide, is so with the Greeks, with the emergence of ancient philosophy, you get this awareness of a level of analysis, of logical analysis that is radically different than the oral indigenous, at least as far as my knowledge. Okay. And that's when when people like the Pythagoreans start saying, hey, there's math and the nature of language is spoken in mathematics. Okay. And the unbelievable nature of the Pythagorean theorem, what it symbolizes is analytic analysis at a level of logical deduction that separates whatever your biases and interests are from what actually is true. And that's why it was so engrossing to them. It's like we can now actually transcend. All right. I would then argue that Socrates, they try that. Socrates picks this up. And essentially what he says is that we're actually stuck at the analytic problem. That's what I would argue Socrates does. And what he basically is he discovers formal epistemology, which is how the fuck do we know anything? Okay. Mm-hmm. And basically concludes that we're all bullshitters. That's when he's the wisest man, because he knows nothing, is because he discovered the analytic problem of justification that could not be extracted from the social and personal problems, and now it becomes this formal fucking problem that his discovery of the formal problem really gives rise to our Western ancient philosophy basically starts here. There's the pre-Socratic and then the Socratic, and the Socratic method hones us in on the analytic problem of justification, which has been tangled up with bullshit. And you can't get rid of the social construction of it all. Okay. Then you get Plato and Aristotle, who give us the first formal ontologies that try to climb us out of the cave of confusion of appearance and justification and achieve ontologies that are transcendent. And you get the formist, idealist ontology of Plato, and then there's the substance physicalism of Aristotle. And then we get these two possible ontologies taking off, okay? And they are philosophically approaching it in the right way. They have a sense of the systematic problem of analytic, but they go with coherentist notions, basically. They're going to try to build they're systemic philosophers that try to create a synthetic philosophy of the whole. Okay, unbelievably brilliant, unbelievably cool, and they go for a long time. They influence, of course, all the Arab traditions later and blah, blah, blah. But they don't, relative to modern science, there's a whole nother jump, the empirical correspondent jump of justification, third person empiricism that comes along with a modern science view that then upgrades our capacity for achieving, addressing the problem of analytic justification applied to the world, applied to the natural world. And that's what the science is. So to answer your question, I think we have gone through these particular phases. I think the major phases of cultural consciousness center on this. Oral indigenous, it's all tangled and embedded in relation, in nature, in world, okay? And they don't really have, and I don't want to feel like I'm, being superior here, and I don't mean this because I think they have an enormous amount to teach us, but they don't think in the same way of logic deduction that we teach people in school. The civilization does that in a particular way, and the traditional formal ways of thinking and writing and systematic give rise to some of this, and the natural science applies a particular methodology to the real world. Postmodern comes on, critiques that and says, you can't have authority of power. You're still tied up in the problem of justification because now you're going to get institutionalized power and you're going to tell people that you have medical problems and you think you know shit, and then you have white male hegemony and all the other goddamn critiques. So you haven't really disconnected it. And the beauty of the meta-modern both sensibility coupled with the tree of knowledge system is actually, we can map this whole fucking thing. We actually know where the entanglement is. We know the nature of the problem. We know what we can claim as transcendent realist in the tentatively, i.e. quantum mechanics, general relativity, although we need aliens to confirm this in a particular kind of way. But we certainly can transcend it culturally. It's not like there's Chinese quantum mechanics. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Of course.
But as we get more and more, the tree of knowledge teaches us, as you get more and more into the ontology of the human, especially more and more practical, now by definition, the justification of what you say is relative to ought to be, if you kind of try to do a science that's applied, like the problem of human psychology into psychotherapy, now you have this massive, my friend Steve Quackenbush, who studies Sartre, is always like, well, as soon as you're at the human, you have the problem of value. Because as soon as you say is, you valued an is that then feeds back on the ought, and you're already screwed. And that's why the human sciences can't be nearly as clean analytically. And that's all part of the entanglement. But anyway, that's the meta-modern idea is that we can, it's an unbelievably complicated issue. You have to understand the history. There's validity on both sides, but there is a synthesis here that we can achieve.
Yeah, so I think I'll frame my concerns in this terms. So we do know that we have an innate motivation to know socially. Okay, so for example, Tomasello's work and so on and so on. My question is, do we have an innate knowledge to know the objective truth? Because as you said before, our capacity to analytically study the cosmos is a product of 1,000 of years evolution of science and philosophy and so on. And so thinking of our natural mechanisms, I am wondering do we have innate motivation to know the truth, or we haven't? So this is the question.
My first thought is no, but I'm also thinking that we don't have the proper way of asking that question yet. And I don't really know how to expound on it from there because of that. But I would say no, because people just seek to justify what we already have. I want to go out and find out why I'm not why I'm wrong. If I'm, against global warming, I'm going to go out there and ignore the 100 studies that say that global warming is a thing, and I'm going to find the one study that says it's not. And that's my evidence. So at least as we've seen it play out with this problem of justification, no, we don't have this drive for objective truth. We have this drive to say that I have the objective truth. I guess that's the way I'd frame it right now.
Yeah, a couple of things. So what I would say is that what emerges is actually this complicated, interpretive, justifying system. Okay, that has lots of weights on it. It is not originally cleaved by nature to solve the problems of reasoning by itself. That's why syllogisms have to be invented. And that's why we're not great at doing straight calculation. We're not built for look at how easy we can build a calculator, but our reasoning system is not designed for quantitative analytic, solutions. It is designed for generating reasons in a social environment. Okay, so that's the first thing. However, by virtue of our capacity to take perspective, which the Tomasello development set the stage for, I then can know that I see the world this way, and that you, Nicholas, see the world this way, and that you, Andrea, see the world this way, and what would it be like if somebody just saw the world in general, like a general observer? That's interesting. We can think about that, and we can certainly then want to know what the truth is in some particular way. People definitely want to know what the truth is. Okay. John Vervaeke gives this example when he asked his people, he said, how many people are really happily married? Okay. Or in a long-term partnership. And then how many of you would want to know if your partner was cheating on you? 95% of the people say, hey, I would want to know. Okay. And a lot of reasons, obviously that's a social context reason and things like that. But there is certainly a desire, and I think we are oriented toward the analytic problem. Some, definitely, we want to know what the truth is, okay? And the context of it and our vulnerability to it is, and our motive, so it's a motivated reasoning system, but sometimes the motive is the analytic truth part. And sometimes the motive is trying to solve the personal issue, and sometimes it's even jamming the personal issue for the social issue, although that's also personal, because you're trying to hold up your reputation or something like that. But
Yeah. So, in your opinion, our ability to know the other perspectives can somehow abstract and think of God's eye, let's say, and God's perspective on things, and yeah, it makes sense. But still is somehow built on our. So I'm not arguing that there is actually that we can think of an analytical problem. I do think that there is an analytical aspect of the justification, but I am trying to ponder how it is nested in our motivation to know socially and to act effectively on our social world. And okay, that's fine for me.
I think that's a beautiful, I mean, I see this as an enormously complicated, first of all, I stick myself in the world. I think this is a very, very complicated thing. I listen to the clinical stories of the people or any number of kinds of things. The part of the dynamic of the problem of justification is this constant dynamic tension between these kinds of forces. Like we want to know truth, but we want to keep our reputation. We want to be sensitive, but we want to be protected. I mean, we're constantly aspectualizing these kinds of issues and often feeling some degree of, tension if we're conscious. Now, I think that a lot of people aren't, just sort of what you were talking about, Nick, is sort of a lot of people once you get motivated, then your confirmation bias, you say you're looking for truth, but anyone from the outside is like, no, you're actually, you're not. I think we're sort of blind to it. I think that's that's a design feature rather than a bug. I mean, although it certainly is a bug that hurts us at times, but I think our own blindness, our experience of being objective and then other people being bullshitters, we see it's so much easier to see a bullshit from somebody else than from ourselves. I think that's absolutely totally designed. I think we feel it though. And I think that's what defenses and the Freudian filter and all of that
exactly
are. So it's I guess my point back is that, it's an unbelievably complex, dynamic, nested problem in the real world that we all deal with. I think it's central to psychotherapy. I think how we narrate ourselves in the social world relative to our heart is, the internalized neurotic loops that people get as they try to jam various boxes in, and then they self-criticize, and then the child motion hurts, transactional analysis kinds of stuff or whatever. All that's. So that's where the action's at.
Yeah. And I like you mentioned also the personal problem, because we didn't mention so far, but it is very crucial. And as you say, the relationships between these three different aspects, and especially the personal problem. So how do I make sense of my existence, of my trauma, of my fucking life? How do I? And so I think that.
Well, this is a very personal thing for me. This is very salient, okay, relative to the whole UTOK. I mean, when I developed the whole thing, so I'm just doing my thing. I like evolutionary psychology, blah, 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 but I'll say it, speak it this way. I'm a normal person. Okay. What I now actually literally can refer to myself as regular Gregg back then. Okay. But then literally something happens to me fundamentally, and I've been dealing with this ever since it happened. So in 1996, I started on the justification. This is at a justification level. This is a really cool idea. I can really contribute something human reasoning. People have been struggling with this, but a lot of people have said similar things. I'm totally fine. I'm super excited that this is a new contribution to a big problem that I'm able to make. But then when the tree of knowledge happens, then I get launched into I make a quantum leap in my experience of knowing, okay? That is the experience of, I can take Einstein's ideas, Darwin's ideas, Skinner's ideas, and Freud's ideas, tie together philosophy and science into a neat shell, and resolve the fundamental problems of knowing in relationship to that humanity's been struggling with for the last 1,000 years, and set us up to effectively deal with the problems of the next century. What?
No, you're effectively saying there that that's breaching the zone of proximal development. That's the finally taking proposition to the point where, because proposition is inherently a meaning making process. So taking that to the point that it kind of breaks itself and creates novelty. That's the transcendent component.
Well, yeah, let me put it, the reason I'm saying it this way in this story is because my phenomenological experience is that's what the tree of knowledge does for me in my perspective, my personal perspective on the world, okay? So my embodied perspective now is my system of justification is I built the tree of knowledge, okay, that does all of this, all right? Now, if you want, now let's talk about the analytic, personal, and social problems that it created. This is what, and then what happens to me is when other people don't see it that way, what my whole point is, well, is it my narcissistic, do I have an underlying narcissistic need for this thing to be everything? Is that why that's why I'm so obsessed with it? Is that why I do want other people to learn it? And I mean, certainly at the time, I also wanted my gratification. There's all this shit with my father and my wife and my friends. I mean, it's a really weird thing. As I tell people, it's very actually, it's not, trust me, it's not easy to empathize with. But if I tell you, if you say you go around and I discovered a unified theory of knowledge, people look at you weird. Like, what the fuck? Okay. And so there was a very real embodied personal dynamic. I mean, it's a really, I ask deep questions about how much of this is my Nietzschean narcissistic need, will to power, I mean, what is this thing that I am seeing? And it took me a long time. And there's still a growth process, but it took me waves of dynamics in conflict with other people. It was a very, very fascinating process. So all I'm really speaking to here is the psychodynamic and interpersonal reality of the social and personal, not whatever the analytic truth claim is. It carried a lot of social personal implication, and the navigation of that was a very, very real for years. It was a very, very real process that I lived through.
Can I try to relate to this then in a different personal experience for me? That's one that I struggle with still, I think, and this is directly within the field of psychology or within the helping professions even, is I'm going to fix you. You're my client, you're my patient, and I'm going to fix you. Yeah. Especially if we're, inpatient where I work now is one thing. I need to be a little more directive there because danger to self and others is a different game. Yeah. But outpatient, I work for them. Like they are in charge. They're my boss in that way. They can say you're fired, Nick. And I'm like, okay. But as the expert, the supposed expert, at least, I'm supposed to be the one guiding them to what I know they ought to be doing. Yep. And if they don't want to do that, how much should I say, well, this is me just imposing my will on them versus this is me saying I need to help them? Yes. That's tough. That's tough.
That's a huge structuring that. Structuring that relation. I teach all the time in my doctoral training. It's like, well, how do you structure it? If you're doing mandated therapy, in fact, I sent out I was supporting Gregg Thomas. He'd done a blog on enrollment, which basically is like cultivating the intrinsic desire, for change and for engagement, the enrollment, we call the investment of the stage of change and the desire to change. That creating that dynamic between directive and their mode, what they believe and what we're bringing to bear, expertise, who has power, who has authority in the therapy room. That's an unbelievably complicated dynamic. And it's one we definitely need to wrestle with. And we spend a lot of time training people about what both the interpersonal process is, the philosophy of this, the complexity associated with it. Thomas Saw's called a secular priest at some level, and because it brings this whole issue of authority, of value to living. Yeah. But then on the other hand, if you try to get around that, then what are you doing there, and what are you claiming? It's a very, very tricky issue, completely. Yeah. And so I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah. And also in my opinion, it is very fascinating how the personal problem is connected to the analytical problem, for example. So, for example, we live, as you as you know, and as we say so frequently, we live in a meta crisis, the crisis of values, crisis of narratives, crisis of religions, of mythologies. And so I do think that our personal ability to make sense is affected by this lack of mythologies and religions. And so, for example, if I lived in the Middle Ages, the mainstream narrative is there is a God, and there is evil and good. But now we live without this kind of narratives, and I do think that it is a big problem that we are in a desperate need of new narratives. That of course they should not be dogmas and so on, but I'm against postmodernism in this sense, because I think humanity needs mythologies, narrative, religions, and living without mythologies and religions is very difficult. And so we have yeah.
Just that, I mean, we can star that. In fact, the other UTOK podcast just with Gregg across the session. I mean, the saying that I'm introducing, at least for the time being, with all of my guests at some point in the conversation, is that I'm framing these constructs versus the Dialogos and all of that, which is, relational building, cultivating understanding. And that's it's from John, and it's a return to Socrates, the dialogue, and communal dialogue. And then it also then says, okay, so what we're after is we're in search of a coherent naturalistic ontology that can revitalize the human soul and spirit in the 21st century. And that is exactly the critique then is that we're stuck between worlds, to use Zach Stein's, at multiple levels, meaning that we had the theistic ontology, and 99% of the people were Christian. You just were in the 15th century, unless you were Jewish. I mean, very, very few people, because it was just everywhere, and there was no, there wasn't any option, and then it made sense at the level of what they knew and everything else. So the social and analytical was all, and then of course, in the natural science worldview blows it up and says, no, well, that's way more complicated. But then it blows it up and gives us what that fills our soul? Very little, as far as I can see. It's thin gruel. And then I think that's a huge deal. And I think so. You're speaking to me, the fundamental meta-modern sensibility, at least the word I would use with it, but that's like, oh my God, this is the task of this century, is to do what you just said, Andrea.
Of course.
And so, and I was just thinking about this earlier. I'm so glad you're talking about that, because it sparked this back for me, is that we, just like what UTOK is like, this, what does Bhaskar call it? The philosophical underlaboring.
Yeah. Where
you're cleaning the rubbish off the ground to make it all make more sense. But to do that, you have to kind of go back to just the very basics, right?
Yeah.
So if we're talking about like what religion and mythos do for us, they give us a lot of that purpose and meaning inherently without even necessarily the need for proposition, although proposition is inherent within it. If we're talking about actual like practices, what do all of these kind of practices have in common is that they want us to generate insight. They want us to trace back our experience. When you're doing a meditation, you're literally bringing yourself back, a lot of meditations anyway, back into like trying to just sit with mind one, just sit with your bare functional awareness and be with that. And through that, there's some sort of healing process. And it's very much exactly the direction we need to go, is backwards in order to go forward.
Totally.
Yeah. And I also think that the scientific worldview has in itself an underlying mythos that I do not know if it is conscious, but I see it like heroic capacity to go against the fate Okay, so in for example in Matrix the movie, do you want to take the red pill or the blue pill? So the science man is brave enough to doesn't give a fuck about well-being and take the red pill because that is the truth. But in fact, it is a mythos.
Totally.
That's a mythos. The hard scientists believe they are not embedded in a mythos, but in reality they do. Because it's a fucking mythos. So you are
their religion.
Hero. Yeah.
Right. So you can escape, death. You can perceive your egoic ideal can be resolved. You can have the Father, shine your accomplishments on you. And I've seen so many scientists whose egoic manifestations, are really unbelievably guiding, shading, motivating their interpretations in particular ways, all while they're saying that they've, transcending reasoning, or they're engaged in transcendent reasoning of the absolute truth. It's totally this. You cannot, if you, and note, all of that is happening absent awareness of the system of justification systems theory, right? I mean, all of that is the idea that you can free when the motive is to really the underlying influence matrix motive of, high influence and dominance and all this other stuff is actually contextualizing all of that framing, and if you don't have awareness of that, your shadow and all of that and the whole capitalist ideology all creates the motivational structure to achieve that. Without reflection, this is where the postmodernism view, in part, or whatever, lots of critical views are like, no way, this ideologies are contextualized. You haven't transcended shit.
Spiritual bypassing, right?
Right. And I would say individually, we can't and shouldn't try to transcend it. I do believe something like quantum mechanics as a public knowledge system can be thought of as transcending, but the physicist himself, who's ever carving out whatever version they want, are embedded in an investment in ideological structure and a perspectival knowing system. And that all of that is entangled in the subject for a particular individual. I mean, all of that, you can't really talk about truth claims at the individual level that are transcendent. I think there are collective truth claims that can be talked about as transcendent.
Yeah. Of course. And that's the reason. Sorry, Nick.
You're good.
Go on.
Well, I was going to ask because I was thinking about this recently. So, I think I posted something like this in the last my last response on the listserv, but my selves don't know that I exist, right? But I am transcendent of my cells, transcending and including, right? So if that's the case, and let's take time into the picture here, the idea of time, it's all happening right here, right now, everything, not literally right here, right now, but everything is kind of stacked on top of itself in that way. So what you were saying, Greg, we shouldn't transcend. I don't even know that we can transcend. My cell can't transcend me. It can't do it. It just, if it could, it would be me. So what am I a cell to? Because I am a cell to something. There is something that's above me right now or in the future, however you want to conceive of that. But it's already happened and is already happening and will continue to happen. So I don't know that we can even try to transcend it. It's just going to be happening.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, I guess a couple of means of transcendence. I mean, certainly we are located in a particular space-time sphere that's then contextualized in the layers of complexification. Okay. So, if we take a periodic table behavior view, each individual person's, say are on the 12th floor of stacking, and we're all then embedded in a culture society system. So we're a particular node in a larger system of justification that's operative. And then, I'm an American, or I'm embedded as a psychologist, I'm in a family. And then, so if you take that level of what is America doing, what's psychology doing, what's my family doing? Well, I'm just a part in that whole. So you do part holarchy. You do a holarchy kind of angle. Clearly, there's holarchies above that. I think that certainly at the same time, though, there is, with each of these levels, there are interesting considerations. And when you achieve explicit self-conscious awareness, this is an interesting feature of our causal world on the one hand. At a general level, the idea of sort of post-convention, like you start to think seriously about who you are and what your reasons are, that starts to post-conventional stance. This begins to transcend whatever the convention. So the conventional sort of ideological intelligence, collective intelligence structure is here, the idea that there are some aspects of it that are really on the edge of that and are doing leading edges, and in some ways could be argued to, transcendence is a complicated word, but in some ways transcend it. I certainly like to think that you can train yourself to adopt sort of the 13th floor terrace view, of the periodic table. You sort of like step outside, you sort of see the whole, and at least allow a perspectival of transcending the whole, even trying to lead the whole in a particular way. We talk about the fifth joint point. Those are all at least metaphors of extending the self to transcend society and transform society in the kind of leading potential edge that you find yourself. So I think that it's both, I guess, within and above, and depending on the meaning.
Of course it would be, right? Both and. It's always got to be.
Yeah. I thought the conversation with Joan was good. You mentioned this, and I think this is good for us to be very clear about, because it took me a little while to sort all this out exactly. And to get proper relation between these other views, like the Galileo Commission view, the whole parapsychology, noetic science view, and all of that. And that is that to me, at least, the message that I want to give is that there's within natural philosophy, just call it within natural philosophy, at the level of coherence that's potentially available within that system. And the argument is that the Enlightenment has inside the system the Enlightenment gap. Okay, so on its own terms, it fails at the level of coherence. That's with all the shit we've been talking about. Had nothing to do with what would be radically new metaphysics about consciousness or anything else. Just inside the own terms, it's confused, and we can do a lot better. And that's really where my attention is. And so my point is that we certainly may need to the TOK metaphysics may be completely inadequate. I mean, maybe there is a whole conscious field of awareness that we connect through and is really awakening the universe from a foundational spiritual ground. That's very plausible at some level to me. And then that would require a massive overview. And then that would integrate or upgrade our naturalistic ontology and massively transform it. And maybe that would be the way to go. Like I said, to me, I want to say I can't get too far with all of that, with all the interesting phenomena of psi phenomenon, reincarnation, anything spiritual ontology at the core, because while I grant its potential, I'm at the level of logos, which means I'm sort of like, I need to then specify with coherence what we're talking about. And I haven't found a lot of richness. I see a lot of evidence of specific pieces of evidence, but I see no schematic frame that affords me clarity, more metaphysical coherence. And I then just say, well, we want metaphysical coherence in the naturalistic philosophy, regardless, So now I believe that I'm at a place where this can be a place, and it's an important one because it's like, how do we position this relative to those kinds of movements, relative to her view, or another's view, and people should be involved in this that share that view. The question is how. And my basic point of it is that, well, inside natural philosophy, we want it to be as coherent as possible. And it sucks right now in terms of coherence. And we've identified problems within its own context that can be betterly addressed better. And it does change your whole relationship to it. John and I were in somewhere in our conversation, I believe that was part of what we taped. I certainly hope it was. He was like, I don't think anybody's a materialist anymore, and certainly not a mechanistic matter in motion materialist, because underneath materialism is a quantum relativistic field theory that behaves totally differently than classic mechanics. And every physicist believes in quantum relativistic field theory. and this struggle to figure out what it is, but it's much more that the base of reality is energy and information rather than mechanics. And if that's the base reality, energy, information, that's a radically different core metaphysics than mechanical billiard balls bouncing into each other. And nobody believes in the billiard ball model anymore. So to the extent that materialism is a billiard ball model from Newtonian mechanics, it's actually dead. I don't think, we use the word materialism a lot, but that's dead. It's been dead for a while.
Yeah. And speaking of natural ontology and the tension with spirituality, I had a topic I wanted to share with you. So I've been wondering about I think the greatest problem in all science, that is how the subjective sense of experience could have emerged from the energy matter. Okay. That is known more popularly as Chalmers' hard problem. Okay,
sure.
And so I was wondering on how to solve it, and I finally landed in panpsychism. Mm-hmm. Okay, because I was wondering that, in my opinion, I at least myself, I cannot see a reasonable way in which the subject can emerge from the object. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if we give primacy to the object and the objective energy, matter, and motion, etc., in my opinion, there's no way the subject can arise from this inert matter. And so the only solution I could see is that matter and spirit, and so basically mind is not a great word. So subject and object, more in a more abstract sense, are the two sides of the same coin. So something of I think neutral monism is about that. And so I wanted to bring this issue into our Dialogos and hear what you guys have to say about it.
Great.
Yeah. So this, I don't know if you were ever. I don't think you were big in attending our the community meetings, Andrea, that we did like months ago. Yeah. I did a presentation on non-duality, and
I know.
You're very much like going there. And one of the points I had made in my presentation, at least according to my non-dual metaphysics, is that I don't consider it panpsychism. A lot of, especially like neo-Advaitists do. I see it, and I see where you're going with it, in that, like everything has consciousness, that consciousness must be the sort of primal thing then, right? But I see it as more like, I don't have consciousness, consciousness has me. So that's different than panpsychism. It's not that everything has consciousness, is that consciousness is something that has everything. It's all included within consciousness, and it's not my consciousness. It's not solipsism. No. Absolutely. Yeah. And also I wouldn't give more important to the subject or on conscience in front of the matter. So I would see them as in balance. Okay. Right. Yeah. And so Gregg, what do you think about this? Yeah.
My take on this is that there are, I am not a panpsychist, although I definitely think it's very important to understand what I would call positionality, the object's positionality in space-time in relationship to its informational access relative to the outside object is definitely, if we were to sort of map it knowledge-wise, those positionalities are key. So you definitely need awareness of relational and positionality of object field. What's the angle? I believe that if I'm talking about just what my objective or scientific naturalistic ontology is, yes, I would say we got to create a knowledge system. First off, I'm a knower. knowing about stuff. So at some level, the knowledge itself is then going to be collected in relationship. It's going to have some known components. Okay. So those are some of the sort of epistemological, ontological kind of considerations. If I were to say, though, that what's going on with a hydrogen atom, I do not need much. I don't know what it would make sense to take as bits of psyche or bits of consciousness at the level of a hydrogen atom. I don't know what that would mean, other than to say that the hydrogen atom is made up of an electromagnetic energy field. Okay, and that electromagnetic energy field will become part of the bits of what becomes a much more collective energy matter information field that then gives rise to consciousness. But I would not say that there's a bit of consciousness inside of a hydrogen atom. I don't know what that would mean. Or even the inside of the sun. I don't think that the sun has anything that would be a bit of psyche or a bit of consciousness. What I do believe is then that the first real subjective emergence happens with life. And what we mean by that is that cells begin. They are information processing and communication systems. They have an epistemic process where the membrane around the cell and its fundamental organization is to metabolize matter, energy, and information. And thus the cell then, that subjectivity, the way it detects forms in the world and approaches certain kinds of things, you get your functional awareness and response of a cell. That functional awareness has a particular kind of biosemiotic meaning-making structure. And then that creates a feedback loop of causation. I don't think that cells have anything that we would identify as conscious experience in terms of pleasure and pain, but I think I can call it cognition, cell cognition, proto-cognition, et cetera. But it's certainly a subjective, there's at an information processing, biosemiotic, complex adaptive systems way. It creates its own history and memory of metabolizing information. That information has particular meanings to that unique subject from the perspective of the cell. And that is, that's the beginning emergence then of what I would call, really psyche in many ways, which would be Aristotle's, the functional form of the vegetative life or the functional form of the biological life.
Yeah.
So that's where I would start. And then I definitely am tracking the evolution of subjective conscious experience, the emergence of subjectivity as we think about it, which I do believe requires a brain.
To clarify my position, I wouldn't say that the cosmic consciousness as possessed, for example, by an hydrogen atom is similar to the animal or the human one, because I would say they in my opinion, they are probably qualitatively different. So I don't think a cell can feel pleasure or pain, of course, because it doesn't have a nervous system. So, but still, panpsychism, a form of panpsychism, call it in whatever form you want, but it is the only logical solution to the emergence of consciousness. Because if I really cannot grasp how the subject conscious experience can poof, can be brought into light from the inner matter. So maybe that's my mistake. Yeah.
No, it's not your mistake at all. I think that this is to me, there are a couple of really great mysteries still, very strong, not mysteries that warrant a complete change in our metaphysics, but mysteries that should be acknowledged. Where the hell does life come from remains a mystery. I mean, I think that the jump in complexity in life, I think we boxed it in. I think you listen to the experts who've got the best models for how matter gives rise to, but there are a lot of jumps they still need to make. So we don't really know that. An even harder problem, I would argue, is the biomechanical engineering problem of subjective conscious awareness. And so I do think you need a brain for that now. But like I said, the complex dynamic ground is biological. So there's a layering of the layering of cognition, functional awareness and responsivity of our biology, which then to me creates the dynamic field, which you have to put in, and then you get a nervous system. But nobody, I got into Brett Alsop. We had a whole, hour-long conversation, and he was getting annoyed with me. He's like, well, but, there has to be a one-to-one correspondence between, say, glutamate and redness. And I was like, actually, that's a physicalist assumption about qualia.
Right.
That's not everybody believes that that's the way the transition happens. A neuroelectronic field that emerges between both some form of top-down adverbial consciousness and then some adjectival emergence of a virtual field doesn't create a one-to-one correspondence with qualia. That's a different model. And we don't know. I mean, I'm a field person more than I am. He was clearly a physicalist. There's going to be some Lego blocking that then there is some sort of mechanical transition that gives rise to conscious. That then the fundamental units are the qualia, the adjectival qualia. I don't know that I believe that. And it just shows how much you don't know. I mean, it's just sort of like, what the fuck is the mechanics of the subjectivity? It's like, yeah, we can neurologically correlate. There's something in the reticular activating system that seems to pop the system up online. If you kill that, the entire system goes dead and you enter into a vegetative state. Then there's an insula, which seems to be tracking lots of sort of affective back and forth, and then you pop it up into the cortex, and then it creates the back and forth structure, say, between a parietal and frontal lobe, if you do the global workspace modeling of human consciousness. And then you got the default mode networks, and they're all bouncing back and forth. So to me, what we get is this neurobiological, energetic correlative mapping with experience on the flip side, but you also have this epistemological, ontological gap portal kind of dynamic that is not clear. And, I have a plasma ball behind me because that's kind of my metaphor for it, that the nervous system pops on and it creates a neurobiological electromagnetic field of some sort that affords a virtual perspectival view of, it creates an epistemological portal, but that's a lot of magical hand waving at one level. I mean, there's an enormous amount of specificity that we have at another level. I mean, it's really fascinating. We know a huge amount of shit, but then there's a couple of gaps in our normal way of understanding the world that this one is a big mystery around. So I don't think it's, I think anybody that doesn't scratch their head on it is probably, it's like quantum mechanics. It's like, you think you understand quantum mechanics? You probably don't. You think you understand the process by which the brain produces subjectivity? We probably don't. At least that's where I am. That's why I think the hard problem is real. And I think it's a crucial problem. I believe, though, that functionally, ontogenetically, conceptually, John, what John and I did, we called it untangling the world nuts, because I think we can box it in, be clear about what it is, and have, recognize that there are lots of good conceptual threads that are being tied together. And at the same time, we should be able to say, well, this was what happened in the brain, and this is why it causes redness or the taste of wine. And there's just nothing that I would assume down the road, if we have a naturalistic explanation, 100 years from now, saying, oh no, actually, this is why this particular activity creates this field, and there's some deep connection between this field and these experiences. And we don't know how to say that.
Yeah. I don't know what to say.
Maybe that would be the miracle. Actually, we're all in some conscious field already, and that's the missing piece. And when we actually see that, we'll wake up to that, and we'll all be part of God's plan or whatever it is. That's a whole nother. That then gets into that would be beautiful and crazy and transformative and all of that. So who knows?
Well, that's kind of what I'm saying is who is this we? Mm-hmm. Like, where do we get this sense that we're separate? Who is it, or who is this I? Like, what makes us think that it's the way that we experience in a top-down way, right? But that doesn't mean our experience of being top-down doesn't mean that that's the way it is.
Yeah.
That is a very dangerous jump to make.
Yeah.
I will always say in true advice form, and I might sound super cocky or certain when I say things, but the only thing I know for sure is that I am. Whatever I is that thing. And it's not separate. It is reality. It is experience. It's all of it, and none of it. It's true non-duality.
Yeah. And also, I've been wondering in these days about the emergence of consciousness in animals, and so I've been thinking a lot about your chapters, Gregg. I think 12 and 13, or 13 and 14, something like that. And so that briefly, these authors think that the first flashes of consciousness are composed by pleasure and pain, basically, and so I was linking that to Freudian thought about the pleasure principle, okay?
Yep.
And so I was thinking about the relationship between pleasure and pain, and I was trying to give a sort of prominency to one of them. Okay, it is more important, pleasure or pain. Freud, in his early years, probably would have answered pleasure, but I came to the conclusion that, in my opinion, and I am just speculating, but in my opinion, pain is a more primordial experience, and maybe pleasure is just like built to reinforce pain, because pain is basically a signal to the nervous system. You have to go away, avoid it. Okay, go away.
Survival.
And pleasure, on the contrary, is okay. This is a good place. You are feeling good. Stay here. Everything is okay. You can relax and so on. And I don't know why I had this this need to give more prominence to pleasure or pain, but I do think that somehow pain is more important than pleasure.
I believe that totally in terms of my intuition. So that's my intuition is pain is the first qualia. Pain's the first qualia. That's what I believe. And so basically the immediacy and the need to signal the whole thing, stop, get the fuck out of there, and the withdrawal reflex and coordinating, that's what I believe. And then the counterbalance of pleasure comes online, then come on after that to then counterbalance the move toward again, get calm and move toward again. That would be the way my intuition strongly suggested. All the books I'm looking at on the early origin of consciousness, I mean, they're various speculations. Most of the early origin consciousness have pleasure and pain, or affective phenomenological consciousness, or feelings. Damasio is very clear on this. So there are a lot of people that are, that feel feelings and have the affective hedonic tone of what John and I landed on as valence qualia being the, I think that they're very good arguments for why pleasure and pain. But actually, my intuition is exactly yours. I haven't seen that elaborated, and I don't think we know enough to really get into really delineating that. But, you stumbled on exactly what my intuition is, Andrea. I think that pain comes first, then pleasure, and then it's the gas brake participatory guidance system that is the base of sentience. That's what I in the animal kingdom.
And I think that's also a very Buddhist acknowledgement. So life is basically pain, and you have to do something with it.
Like the suffering, right? The base of your soul is suffering. That's right.
So think about that, though.
Good luck.
Like suffering and pain, they're supposed to bring you closer to God. That's what they are. Yeah. That's what the purpose of it is in mythos. And what does it do in biology? What does pain do is it literally breeds pleasure. It breeds all of the expansion of life from that is suffering and pain. So, we talk about wanting to reduce unnecessary suffering, but there is absolutely a necessary suffering.
Totally.
Of course.
Completely,
of course.
100% agree.
Yeah.
And I think our culture completely gets this wrong at the level. We're so confused about character. We're so confused about our values. We just basically then impute, oh God, you're in pain, get out of it. That the anxiety, the depression, the low self-esteem is the problem, as opposed to the symptom of the problem or a response to the problem. I'm like, well, what's the relationship between the pain, the emotional pain you feel based on the real, struggles and rejections and bitterness and traumas versus the symptom of the fucking problem. I mean, we don't even talk. That's how do you disentangle that? It's a complicated issue, but we should be aware you need to, and that there's necessary pain, right? Obviously, at some level, and it's at the root. What do we feel? I remember the relief I felt after having a chronic pain. I had a cyst in my back, and that started in the end of June, and then went all the way, and then I finally got surgery at the end of October, I think it was. That sucked. Sucked, totally transformed my life in a bad way. I learned some things from it, but I learned, for example, that actually I went down to so many, broken back people stories online. You want another sad world, people that had horrible back surgeries and then totally screwed them up. So I went into this world. I learned that chronic pain actually has to go on for 6 months. Your feeling system, by the time you're 3 weeks in, it feels chronic. Trust me, but then my whole point on this was the relief after the surgery, and there were some complications, but then I was like, oh my God, this is what it feels like to feel nothing. Love nothing feels pretty damn good when you've been, buzzed for months on end and really down your leg. Actually, it was sciatic pain that I had, but anyway. So yeah, it's the absence of pain then, right? You could then totally see pain and then the absence of it, then start to crave the absence of it. And then you start to emerge. What's that feeling? You can just see how the system, still imagining a lot, but there really are the best early consciousness stuff is this, as far as I'm concerned. What happens when you go from jellyfish with distributed neural networks, okay? No centralized control system and no centralized movement system. They drift a little bit, they have some, but they don't have. Then you get a bilateral plan, okay, like in a worm, all right? You get a head up here, and then it has to coordinate its movement some, okay? And then it starts to get a brain, and the sensory and motor stuff starts to come along, and you have, sort of aspects of the neuromuscular structure, okay? But then you get the arthropod jump, basically in the Cambrian explosion. They're not really called arthropods, but they're like arthropods. They basically jump out as crabs. And so in a 20 million year period, you go from basically worms to crab-like creatures, okay? And these have eyes as stalks, and they have segmented bodies, and they run along, and they clearly engage in predation and prey and mating and territory defense, and that is the jump. Now you have a whole complex active mechanical body that's in movement, that's now connected to a sensory system. And what happens at the brain is that it coordinates the external mapping, what I call my PME, the perception, which is basically how do you create a model of the animal and the environment on the exterior. Then the M, which I call motivation, which is the interior reception, the statement of the body. Are you hungry? Do you have pain, structural, or you have issues? And then you have E as energized motion, okay? And then you have centralized control systems that plug these three domains together, which creates a control system, which is like, where are you? Where do you want to be? And then now you invest energy and then see what you get the feedback on, okay? And then the linkage between all of that could then send out pain broadcast, which is like, oh shit, there's something out here. Oh shit, you're hurt here. And what you're doing ain't helping. That's the pain signal. So stop and do something else. The pleasure signal is what you see and then what you want, and you are moving towards it, then bing. And so then you could vibrate through the entire system, the emergence of a subjective field that basically good, bad, and that becomes the basic structure of feelings. And what that means is our whole affect system is now bodily ingrained in the position that we have in our body in the environment. And that feels right. If you do psychotherapy, you go right into the body. What does the body feel? And then gives rise to then larger experiential, affective, relational stuff. But that's later. The fundamental grounding is you in the body, and the way the body feels is positive, negative, entangled, defensive, or open, exploratory. So I think the evolution argument is good. I think the functional argument is good. I think the clinical argument is good for all of that. And, it's a story that comes together. It coheres. It's a story that coheres, definitely. It has a lot of if not direct evidence about this is what consciousness is in these creatures, which is very hard. We still don't know, but a lot of indirect evidence that says, when you look at, like, if you bring anesthesia to them, if you look at what their reinforcement history is, you can demonstrate they are seeking pleasure and pain, I think, behaviorally quite nicely.
Yeah. And if you think about it, I think the major aim of clinical psychology is, wait a minute, not only physical pain and medical pain, traditional pain is important. There is also a very important part of your existence that is called psychological well-being and pain, and we have to deal with it. But yeah.
I mean, I'm right on top of that, what then I would call the heart. And the influence matrix maps the heart, the experiential system. So you have your positive and negative affect systems. And then you have the whole self-other system. In fact, Theodore Milan, if you know him as a personality theorist, said you have active, passive, pain, pleasure, self-other. And then that's the affective heart. And the influence matrix maps at least the process dimensions and sets the stage for your attachment system, your internal working models, the current person, the past person, what the hell you're trying to do, and tracking your extent to which your reputation and honor and you're valued by others, high relational value, social influence, versus you've been abandoned, rejected, diminished, which is, of course, then the core of your place in the social world, which your survival, mating, everything that would have depended upon, your real world at the social mammal level. So that we walk around with that, and that is unbelievably crucial. And like what it says, one of the things it says is that we need to have social influence, like instrumental value, but we also need to be held, and those are not the same thing. Okay. But when we created our society, capital wise, and we had a mechanistic view of what people are, it's like, oh, well, we'll give them money, and then in exchange of that, we'll do this, and we'll have instrumental value. But that then creates a real tension between, well, who am I? What am I really known for? What if I'm no longer an instrumental value? I'll manipulate you and all this other stuff. The whole message then basically pulls out our instrumentality, be like, what would it be like to be paying you to be a good father? Well, we'll give you $10 every day that you pat your son on the back and tell him a good job, and you'll get $10 for that. I mean, everyone should go, what the fuck? That would be horrible. We shouldn't pay and the reason is because we want to be valued in real world. There are deep, good reasons for that. So in psychotherapy wise, that's the network of at least the internalizing conditions. There's thought disorder and a whole, and addiction and externalizing conditions. But the cluster of internalizing conditions is this injured heart, this vulnerable heart, this defensive heart, this narrator that can't figure out what the hell to do with it, blame self, blame other, and just in a chronic state of distress. And that's, blame's too strong. Our society creates so much more of that than would be necessary if we had the right understanding of ourselves and our natures and the kinds of social worlds that we can create. It's really sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm reminded of this story about Ramana Maharshi, and I actually had a very similar experience, just in talking about pain and transcendence and all this personal transformation. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Ramana Maharshi at all.
Yeah, you mentioned him before.
The one in black and white there. He's basically the father, or I wouldn't say the father of non-duality, but that's more Adi Shankar. But he's like the 20th century Hindu sage, really. And there's this whole thing about him having attained enlightenment when he was having this panic attack, and he thought he was dying when he was a teenager, and there was nobody around to save him. And he just has this odd thought, well, if I'm going to die, I might as well be here for it. So he just laid down and kind of just said, okay, let's let it happen then. And then to his surprise, nothing happened. And then that release sort of brought him into that non-dual state. And I use this as an example when I run acceptance groups all the time. Sure. That I used to struggle with panic attacks myself, really severe panic attacks. They make you feel like you're going to die. Totally. Like I'm about to be sucked up into the freaking sky or something. It's very intense. At one point in my life, I was just like, fuck it, I can't do this anymore. I cannot fight this thing. It gets worse when you fight it. I can't. Go ahead, kill me. Do it. Yeah. Do it. And it didn't. It doesn't. It can't. And when you only by going through that and allowing that to happen, do you experience that catharsis, that release, which takes you to that next level that helps you appreciate and understand that aspect of the experience of the actual reality so much better, because you'll never be able to really think about that and get it.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, that reminds me, I wanted to mention this to you, especially you, Nick, but both of you. So I've been syncing up with a lot with Bruce Alderman and Layman Pascal. So those guys run the integral stage. So they are really cultivating a sort of post-Wilberian integral post-metaphysics version, and they're exploring lots of stuff. They have their own sort of metaphysics and their own very wide view of the world. And my experience with both of them, they're super intense, super deep guys. So this is a really exciting thing for me because it's sort of like, and we are finding the unified theory and their version of integral. I mean, they're really, really tight. So it's really exciting. So I did a conversation with Layman Pascal, and I definitely encourage folks, if you want to listen to it. I think it's a beautiful conversation. We were talking about getting up in sync. I had a second conversation that will be part of the UTOK with Gregg podcast, and we'll release that at the end of the month. And then a conversation with Bruce. I walked Bruce through the whole I-Quad path, we talked a little bit about this is a whole I-Quad path, crazy shit. But what was unbelievable was both Bruce and I was talking with then Layman. As I was explaining to him, Layman was like, well, obviously non-dual just means not two. And so what you're basically doing is you're just corresponding the observer to the observed and making an equivalency in relation. And I was like, yes, and I'm doing it across logos. Okay. And so this was a huge, nice networking structure that basically is bridging then the TOK logos analysis into non-dual in a particular way that is, that's tight. Okay. Because and what I was saying to him is like, actually, right. Because science, I always talk about like science is behavior. It's science behavior that's observed, observer behavior. And then the whole point of the I-Quad, actually, one aspect of the equivalency is I become the photon released at bang. And then it's the energy information of that my epistemological system tracks and then becomes one with. That's an observer-observed non-dual unity. And that's like, boom, not two, and that's...
Right.
That's fucking cool.
That's what I think of a lot of like with single aspect monism is that this thing literally, it becomes your God and it's you at the same time.
That's exactly some of the Henriques equivalency is that it is the photon and the NOR get dropped into reducing the fundamental unit of the mathematical or NOR operator on top of the thing that becomes the thing and they bink. And so you get a non-dual connection. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you and say that there is, I think, an integral, unified kind of deal because the way in which the unified grounds naturalistic ontology differently. But now as we sync up their version of sort of post-integral stuff, it's a very exciting sync up. It's like my syncing up with John, but now it's syncing up with the sort of the latest version of integral too. So that's a really, really cool thing.
I'm definitely going to go check that out. That sounds awesome. I saw the
and actually one other thing I say, sorry, I got all excited, but they're starting an integral stage psychotherapy thing. So they just released the first one. I don't remember the guy's name, but actually the guy was talking about it. Of course, the guy was talking about integral psychotherapy, and it was super similar to my view. And I know it's close to Andre Marquis, my good friend. He's an expert in integral psychotherapy. But just listening to this other guy talk about the process, I could map virtually everything he was doing, and his angles on various stuff to UTOK and all that other stuff. So I think there's the potential, just kind of like when Roy Bhaskar stuff, critical realism got hooked up with integral, we can push a UTOK critical realist integral synthesis of some sort as this meta-modern philosophical worldview. So I'm super psyched about that. And I figured I want to share that with you.
Yeah, that's so cool, man.
So
that's how I got involved with you in the first place, right?
Right. We had the SEPI comment. It's like, oh my God, somebody on SEPI other than Andre knows about integral. And that's really, man. The integral community, where they are, that's what Bruce and Layman are like no, this, and then I'm feeding them the backstory, the whole garden and everything. And they're like, oh my God. And then it's like, well, Layman, Pascal, and Bruce, they have their super cool integral post-metaphysics. They do this grammatology and adjacent metaphysics stuff that blew my mind. I was like, fuck. That takes Wilbur's shit, jumps it out to a whole nother level, and it plugs right into where I'm thinking too. Like it clarified a few key points. So we're syncing up really, really cool. It's a very, very nice.
Oh, wow.
That's a horizon activity that's networking. So an integral unified wave is coming.
In a way that terrifies me. I don't know if the world's ready.
Well, we're going to keep it private. We'll just do it. That's why I'm not really marketing these things. We'll show it on, little people can find it. Well, what the whole point here is we'll sync this up and we'll seed it. And that's what I told Layman. I was like, hey, Layman, what we'll do is you take all this shit, you put it through your model or your mindset of it, because he's brilliant putting shit together. And then we'll figure out how to market it at the right level of frequency. It's all about the frequency of observer relation. And we'll drop the transcendental beacon to the right zone of proximal development. And if I can drop this into other people and they can metabolize it and then get it away from this crazy looking cartoon and all the ego dynamics, some unified theorist bullshit, we get that out there and then just start sending it out mysteriously, like, from some other portal. That actually can pull, and then if we release that in the right way, that actually is the right way to get large numbers. So after we kind of metabolize it, we all get on the same page. We also really start to speak the same language. That's what's exciting. And then once we have the core language, then we can start figure out how to disperse it at the right zone of proximal development with the right frequency to get people like, oh my God. So.
Yeah.
So sorry, Gregg, I don't know very well Wilbur's integral theory. So if you can just in a minute synthesize in what way the integral theory complements the UTOK approach, it would be fine. It would be great. Yeah.
So integral. So Wilbur is a philosopher. Sort of
I know Wilbur.
Okay, so the best way to go, the all qual is the basic frame. It's sort of like UTOK all qual. Okay, which means all quadrants, all lines, or all levels, all stages. So he has this basic architecture that starts with quadrants. Okay, and really I call them epistemological quadrants, but that's because I really think that's what he's after. But the quadrants are as follows. There's the upper, what he did in 1995, he'd written a lot and he was seeing a big picture of it was philosophical, psychological, spiritual. Mm-hmm. And then he was organizing all the views he was organizing and then created this schematic. It's 2x2 schematic. And the 2x2 schematic creates the quadrants. Okay.
I know the quadrants, the I, we. Right?
Yep. Right. Yep. It's I, we. Good.
Okay. I know it.
Interior, exterior. Views and then single collective. Okay. So he has that. And the other huge element that he tracks is the evolution of consciousness. Okay. Your stages. So he builds off of this guy Gesber's work and a few other people that are basically on the spiral dynamics, it's what's called, and looks at the various ways in which he looks at development across lots of different lines, like, okay, your cognitive development, your emotional development, your ego development, your moral development. This nutshell that he basically looks like, well, there's where say normal society is, then you jump up into whatever the conventional society is, and then you go post across all these different lines. Okay, he looks at developmental lines. He then thinks about the ways in which consciousness operates at states and sort of the architecture of your understanding at stages. Okay, so if I don't remember if you were here, but if I started talking green, all right, there's a whole layer of colors that he talks about. Green like is postmodern, orange is like modern. Then I get a little fuzzy going beneath that, but there's amber. I think amber, and then red. But basically, these are more tribal, pre-conventional into then, so you like, okay, I'm a national kind of like really, and then I'm scientific, and then I'm post-scientific. And then he calls second tier, which is the capacity to include and transcend all of them and then integrate them into a holistic so you're not stuck at a particular stage. It's the ability to transcend and include each of the consciousness stage before you. That's what makes second tier. And second tier then corresponds a lot to meta-modern, which is at least in the meta-modern. That's why Wilber's ideas in the meta-modern community, because the meta-modernism is very much about kind of seeing the developmental stages of our cultural codes and consciousness and then transcending them. And in fact, Wilber developed a matrix with this guy Combs, this Wilber Combs matrix.
Looking it up right now.
The relationship between states and stages and cultural dynamics, like what kind of culture are you in? What is your normal state in? What is the stage that you're in? So he does a lot of cool articulation about sort of the development of cultural conscious sensibility stuff. And it's this entire community of sort of like that's outside the academy. In fact, he's not, it's definitely sort of certainly some serious academics follow him, but it's not embedded in academic knowledge. It's more embedded in the culture of Integral, which he then tried to launch as sort of like a community. And then it kind of broke up, really. There was some shitty time periods where it sort of broke up. And now there was what they call the Integral diaspora, which is like everybody was following Ken, and then they had to break out of him because definitely had a Ken guru. That's what I want to avoid. I want a fucking guru bullshit. But Ken sort of became a guru as he tried to manage it and then create these stages. And he went through a period where he seemed like he was kind of being a little bit of an asshole, and he got in fights with a lot of different people, and that broke up the structure. So that the nutshell is that the epistemological insights that then organize the capacity to see different things. This also then gives rise to the integral pluralistic methodology, which means you look through the world, you learn how to look through the world through the quadrants, you gather the knowledge systems that have been built off those quadrants and learn how to integrate them. And you think about really the most important thing is the stages of development and how to build a particular kind of consciousness that moves towards the growth of second tier, which is the ability to include and transcend and include all the others to create a holistic way of being. That's the other way I would give it a snapshot. But Nick, if there's stuff that I'm,
No, you're pretty much nailing that there. I mean, I put a link into the chat here for integrallife.com.
I copied it. Yeah.
Yeah. It'll have a lot of the information there. It's got a graphic of the Wilber-Combs lattice. The AQUAL model is it's complicated, but it's very, very useful, very, very interesting. And just like it's just another big history kind of thing, really. And yeah, like Gregg said, it's really outside of the institution. I only heard about it in all of my education. It was only a small part of my graduate history and systems class. And that was just because the guy he was very into Eastern tradition. So he happened to know about Wilber's influence there. So it's not even a guarantee that anybody would hear his name in an academic program.
If you're interested in some readings, I can send you some links. And then if you want more books there, his magnum opus is Sex, Spirituality, and Ecology. I catch that right, 1995. The Integral Psychology is pretty good. That's certainly what I read. I read Integral Spirituality, if memory serves. There's Marriage of Sense and Soul. There's A Theory of Everything. Those are the books that I also read his post-Trump book, which he came out with applying. What's that?
Spectrum of Consciousness is, if it's not his first, it's one of his first books. It is the classic. That's a definite read too.
Yeah. Actually, I don't think I've read that one.
But he became a sort of guru. And so.
What's that?
I don't know. So he became a guru in the years.
He published lots of books. I think he really gets famous with 1995 book. His wife dies a horrible death. She gets sick and dies right in front of him, basically I think she got cancer or something. And then he woke up one day and she's dead in the bed, if memory serves. And
he was with her, I think, when she died, like laid up all night with her. There's I forget the name of the book.
Grace and Grit, I think.
Yeah.
Yep, Grace and Grit. Yep.
Fantastic book.
Really good book.
Tearjerker.
Yeah, it's brutal. I mean, anyway, but there are a series of events that really then make him from, a lot of people read his books to then becoming the integral community. Like late 1990s, he really then launches like the Center for Integral Studies or something like that. There's Colorado and California domains, and then they try to then create a community, which at first goes, and there's a lot of cool stuff because it carries a lot of practical stuff. It fills a lot of gaps. I think, when I first came across it was like 2004. I published the 2003 article. I remember this, and then somebody wrote me and said, well, hey, you're trying to unify psychology. Well, Wilber did a lot of this. What do you think of him? And I'd never heard of Wilber. After that I know that because I was already published, and I was like, oh, fuck. And then I read about him. And because I was on the inside of the academy and I was an atheist and I was an empiricist much more then, I was like, this guy's a spiritual ontology bullshit, blah, blah, blah. And I was fairly dismissive, probably defensive because I could have cited him. And he saw a few things that I definitely didn't see. But I will confess my first reaction was pretty negative. Then I met Andre Marquis, my good friend, and he's an expert in integral and approached integral psychotherapy and taught me his lens on seeing the psychotherapeutic world. And it's a definitely powerful, integrative, big picture view. I then went back to it a little softer and read a lot of the stuff like 2008, 2011, partly in my book and other things. And then I was friendly towards Wilber, meaning they were integral attitudes, but still, thought of the superiority, my own view. But now I'm looking at it with a lot more embrace and just now is the whole integral, plural, meta-modern kind of view where everybody's bringing their versions, the need for spirituality, the critique of the materialist flatland, all of that stuff resonates really, really strongly. So I consider myself I don't share the ultimate ontology, but I also have a much better frame where I can relate to it without any dissonance or threat. And know what the tree of knowledge is about when it's not, and say very clearly that the tree of knowledge and the whole solving of the problem of psychology, Wilber doesn't get that. He doesn't really understand. He glasses over it and he doesn't understand the problem of psychology well. He is a nice map of all the various places and has an architecture for synthesizing, but he doesn't really get the fundamental metaphysical confusion, like he doesn't dive into what is behavior, what is mind relative to consciousness, what are the different paradigms and how would you organize them, other than here is the way the all-qual system would pull them. And it's good, but at the level of specificity and precision of terminology, it's confusing. There's a lot of shit that he just jams in there and says, this works. And it's like, no, from an academic critique perspective, you are making a lot of shit up. And I could nail the crap out of a lot of this inconsistency. But that's the way it works. So anyway, I love an integral unified, at least perspective sharing and growth in that direction, especially with Layman Pascal. And to add to my friend Andre Marquis, it's really great to see. And, I'm looking forward to those conversations going forward. So
right.
All right, guys. Well, I noticed that the clock is 2:07. It seems like we went through a nice little romp here. Get back caught up with you.
Yes, this is great.
So I definitely enjoy these times to circle into these concepts and, bat them around. And I also appreciate your feedback on the book and all these ideas and all that. So it's great.
Great. Right. So we will see again in 2 weeks, right?
We'll do it again in 2.
2 weeks.
That's on my calendar. All right, friends. All right, man.
Bye. Bye, guys. Take care. Bye.
Bye.